The first hint of consciousness was the weight. It was a dense, living pressure settled directly over his sternum, rising and falling with a rhythm that was not his own. Elias Thorne, a man whose entire existence was a fortress built of discipline and solitude, did not permit anomalies. His mornings were scripted with military precision. Awake at 0430, the floorboards cold beneath his feet, the mountain air ablaze against his skin. Coffee, black and bitter, a grueling workout in the barn that served as his gym. Then the long, silent hours of the day, filled with the maintenance of his self-imposed exile. Yet this morning, the script had been torn apart. The wait was an unscripted line, a foreign actor on his private stage. He kept his eyes closed, running a diagnostic threat assessment as he had been trained to do 10,000 times. His breathing was unobstructed. The weight, while heavy, was not crushing. There was a sound, a soft exhalation of air and a scent, musky, earthy, the smell of damp fir needles and wild animal. His senses, honed by years in theaters of war where a misplaced scent could mean the difference between life and death, cataloged it instantly. A canine, not a wolf, whose scent carried a sharper, more feral edge. This was something different. His body remained perfectly still, a coiled spring of potential energy, but his mind raced. The cabin was secure. He checked the locks every night, a ritual as ingrained as cleaning his rifle. The windows were latched against the encroaching Colorado winter. No entry point, impossible. Yet the proof lay breathing on his chest. Slowly, with an economy of motion that bespoke years of training, he opened his eyes. The pre-dawn light was a weak gray wash filtering through the single window of his Spartan bedroom. He saw a pointed muzzle, dark as polished obsidian. He saw ears, tall and alert, swiveling slightly to catch the whisper of the wind outside. A German shepherd. Her head was turned away, resting on his chest as if it were a pillow she had every right to use. Her fur was a thick sable, matted with ice crystals and burrs. She was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that vibrated through his own body. He could feel the sharp ridges of her spine and ribs through the thin material of his shirt. She was starving. His training screamed at him to move, to neutralize the unknown factor, to re-establish the sterile perimeter of his life. But something else, an older, more deeply buried instinct, held him in place. It was the absolute trust in her posture. She was not a threat, she was a supplicant. She had breached the walls of his fortress not as an invader, but as a refugee seeking sanctuary from the storm that raged outside. He could hear it now, the wind shrieking like a banshee around the eaves of the cabin, hurling pellets of ice against the glass. An internal winter to match his own. He looked at the dog, and in the profound exhaustion of her stillness, he recognized a piece of himself. For 3 years since the accident that had claimed his wife, Sarah, and since the IED that had taken Ghost, his K9 partner, he had been just like this, still, cold, and waiting for an end. The dog shifted, a low groan escaping her throat. She lifted her head, and for the first time, her eyes met his. They were the color of warm amber, intelligent and ancient, and filled with a pain so profound it stole the air from his lungs. There was no fear in them, only a desperate, silent plea. In that gaze, the soldier in him receded, and the man he had tried so hard to bury, felt a flicker of something he had long since written off as a casualty of war: empathy. He saw not just an animal, but a fellow wounded warrior. He slowly raised a hand, calloused and scarred, and laid it gently on her head, between her ears. Her shivering eased almost instantly. She leaned into his touch, a sigh shuddering through her emaciated frame. It was the first gentle contact he had initiated with another living being in 3 years. The weight on his chest suddenly felt less like a burden and more like an anchor. He remained there for a long time, the dog's warmth a small ember against the frozen landscape of his grief. The rigid discipline of his mourning was shattered. 4:30 came and went. The mission had changed. His new objective was clear, simple, and undeniable. Protect this creature. He carefully, slowly, slid out from under her, and her eyes followed his every move. She did not growl or tense. She watched, He moved to the kitchen, his bare feet silent on the cold wood. He opened a can of tuna, the smell filling the small space. He mixed it with a splash of water in a bowl and set it on the floor. She rose on unsteady legs, her body a fragile architecture of bone and fur, and approached the offering. She ate with a desperate, frantic hunger that was painful to watch. While she was occupied, he did a quick perimeter check of the cabin. The locks were all secure, the windows sealed. He was baffled until he entered the small pantry. There, behind a stack of firewood, a section of the floorboards near the foundation had been pried loose, likely by the relentless pressure of the frost heave. The gap was just large enough for a determined, slender animal to squeeze through. She had found the one weak point in his defenses. After she finished the food, she looked at him, then walked purposefully to the front door, nudging it with her nose before letting out a soft whine. It wasn't a request to leave. It was an instruction. She looked back at him, her amber eyes insistent. He understood. There were more. She was a mother. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't sought shelter for herself alone. She had come for aid, a new storm of emotion, one he was ill-equipped to handle, brewed within him. He pulled on his insulated boots, his heavy parka, and grabbed a pair of thick gloves. He found a high-powered flashlight in his gear locker. As he opened the door, the wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the wall. The world outside was a maelstrom of white, a furious, blinding blizzard that had descended upon the mountain overnight. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The mission parameters had just escalated from challenging to suicidal. The dog, however, showed no hesitation. She plunged into the swirling snow, turning back only to ensure he was following. Elias secured the door and leaned into the gale, the wind a solid wall against him. He followed the dark shape of the shepherd, his training kicking in. He noted landmarks, a crooked pine, a distinct rock formation, building a mental map to find his way back. She led him away from the cabin, up a steep, wooded incline. The snow was already knee-deep, and with every step he felt the familiar burn in his thighs, the cold seeping into the marrow of his bones. This was the kind of cold that killed. But the dog pressed on, her desperation a tangible force pulling him forward. She was fighting against time, against the storm, against the inevitable. It was a fight he knew all too well. After a grueling 20 minutes that felt like an eternity, she stopped near a massive, fallen ponderosa pine, its roots ripped from the earth to form a dark, hollowed-out cave beneath. She whined again, a high, keening sound of pure maternal anguish, and disappeared into the darkness. Elias knelt, aiming the beam of his flashlight into the hollow. What he saw broke through the final layers of ice around his heart. Huddled together for warmth were 3 tiny puppies, their eyes barely open. They were whimpering, their small bodies trembling violently. 2 were sable like their mother, but one was a deep, solid black. They were dying. The cold was already claiming them. Without a second thought, he shrugged off his parka. The sub-zero air hit him like a physical assault, instantly stealing his breath. He laid the coat down, its fleece lining creating a warm nest. The mother, whom he had already named Sheba in his mind after a long-lost queen, seemed to understand. She began nudging her pups, one by one, onto the coat. 2 of them, though weak, responded. But the third, the little black one, was limp and unresponsive. Its breathing was shallow, a faint puff of vapor in the frigid air. Elias's heart seized. He remembered holding Ghost in his arms in the dust of Kandahar, feeling the life ebb out of his partner, his friend. He would not let that happen again. Not here, not now. He gently scooped up the tiny, cold body. It was terrifyingly light. He unzipped his fleece vest and tucked the puppy inside, directly against his skin. Its coldness was a shock, but he held it tight, willing his own body heat to become a furnace, to spark its fading life back into existence. He looked at Sheba, her amber eyes glowing in the flashlight's beam, and saw a reflection of his own fierce, desperate resolve. He gathered the parka, cradling the other 2 pups in its folds like precious cargo. "Let's go home," he said, his voice raw and unfamiliar in the roaring wind. The words hung in the air, foreign and strange. Home. He hadn't called this place home in 3 years. It had been a shelter, a forward operating base. a prison, but never a home. The journey back was a brutal, disorienting fight against the elements. The wind howled, trying to rip the precious bundles from his arms. His own body heat was plummeting, but the faint, fragile heartbeat he could feel against his chest drove him onward. He navigated by instinct and memory, his internal compass locked on the coordinates of his cabin. When the dark silhouette of the structure finally emerged from the white chaos, a wave of relief so powerful it buckled his knees washed over him. He stumbled through the door, slamming it shut against the storm's fury, and collapsed to his knees on the hearth. The cabin, once a monument to his sterile grief, was instantly transformed. It became a field hospital, an incubator, a sanctuary. He laid the parka with the two shivering pups as close to the stone fireplace as was safe and stoked the embers into a roaring blaze. He gently retrieved the small black puppy from inside his vest. It was still limp, but he thought he could feel a slight lessening of the chill in its tiny body. Its breathing was still terrifyingly shallow. He rubbed it vigorously but gently with a soft towel, trying to stimulate its circulation. Sheba, the noble mother, stood over him, whining softly, her nose nudging his hand as if to offer encouragement. He worked with a focused intensity he hadn't felt since his last mission. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the hermit haunted by ghosts. He was a medic, a protector, a man with a purpose. He found an old box and lined it with Sarah's softest wool blanket, a pale blue one she had loved. He hesitated for only a moment, the scent of her, faint but still present, a punch to the gut. But the needs of the living outweighed the reverence for the dead. He placed the puppies inside, positioning the box near the fire. He warmed some milk, adding a touch of honey for energy as he'd seen a farmer do once, and used an eyedropper to carefully squeeze a few drops into the black puppy's mouth. It swallowed. A tiny, reflexive action, but it was a victory. It was life. He spent the next hour alternating between the pups, ensuring they were warm, feeding the weakest one drop by precious drop, and tending to their mother. He cleaned the mats and burrs from Sheba's coat and examined her for injuries, finding only scrapes and the profound exhaustion of a mother who had given everything for her children. As the day wore on, the storm outside raged, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace took hold. The pups, warmed and fed, fell into a twitching, snuffling sleep. The little black one, nestled against its siblings, began to breathe more deeply. Elias sat on the floor, his back against the hearth, watching them. The rigid order of his world had been replaced by a beautiful, messy chaos. There were towels on the floor, the scent of wet dog and warm milk in the air, and the soft sounds of sleeping creatures. It was the most alive the cabin had felt in years. He watched the puppies, and their distinct personalities began to emerge even in sleep. One of the sable pups was larger and bolder, kicking its legs as if dreaming of great adventures. The other sable was smaller, quieter, pressing itself deep into its mother's side. The little black one was the most still, a watchful soul even in slumber. He named them. It was a mistake, he knew. Naming things meant attachment, and attachment meant the potential for more pain, more loss. But he couldn't help himself. The big, clumsy one was Tank. The quiet, watchful one was Whisper. He looked at the mother, Sheba, who now lay with her head on his knee, her amber eyes closing in exhausted trust. He had a family. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He had failed to protect his first family, Sarah, his wife, Ghost, his brother in arms. The guilt was a constant, heavy cloak. But now the universe, in its cruel and mysterious way, had given him a second chance. A new mission. 2 days passed in a blur of caregiving. The blizzard finally broke, leaving the world outside buried under a thick blanket of pristine, silent snow. Inside the cabin, life was anything but silent. Tank had discovered his legs and used them to stumble into everything. The leg of the table, the water bowl, his own siblings. He was a tiny, four-legged battering ram of pure, unadulterated joy. His foolish heroism was a constant source of low-level chaos that chipped away at Elias's solemnity. Elias found himself holding back a smile when Tank, in a valiant effort to attack a stray piece of firewood, tumbled head over paws, and looked up with an expression of profound, baffled surprise. Whisper, by contrast, was his shadow. The little black pup was still the weakest, but his spirit was strong. He would watch Elias with an unnerving intensity, his dark eyes seeming to understand the shadows that lurked behind the man's own gaze. He was a mirror, a reflection of the quiet, wounded parts of Elias's own soul. It was Whisper who cemented the breach in Elias's defenses. On the third morning, as Elias sat by the fire cleaning his rifle, a ritual of meditation and control, he felt a small, wet nose press against the back of his hand. He froze. It was Whisper who had cautiously ventured away from his mother and siblings for the first time. The puppy looked up at him, then gave his hand a tentative lick before curling up against his boot, as if declaring this large, quiet man his personal mountain of safety. The simple act of trust was a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for years. A single tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path through the stubble on Elias's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. His newfound peace was shattered by a knock at the door. It was so unexpected that for a moment he thought he had imagined it. No one ever came to his cabin. He had made sure of that. He moved to the door, his body instinctively shifting into a guarded posture. He opened it to find a small, wiry woman with a cloud of silver hair and eyes that were both kind and impossibly shrewd. She held a large, steaming pot in her gloved hands. "Figured you might be snowed in," she said, her voice raspy but warm. "I'm Martha, from down the valley. Saw the smoke from your chimney change. Seemed busier." Elias was speechless. He simply stared at her, unsure of what to do. Martha peered past him into the cabin, her eyes landing on the makeshift nursery by the fire. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. "Well, now, looks like you've got company." She pushed past him gently, as if she had been invited. "Beef stew," she announced, setting the pot on his kitchen counter. "My boy, Michael, he always said my stew could cure anything from a broken heart to a gunshot wound. He was in the Army, 10th Mountain." The casual mention of her son, the past tense, created an instant, unspoken bond between them. They were both members of a club no one ever wanted to join. Martha moved about his kitchen as if she owned it, ladling stew into a bowl for him, her presence filling the silent space with a gentle, grandmotherly energy. She cooed over the puppies, her experienced hands checking them with a practiced gentleness. "This little one is weak," she said, nodding at Whisper. "But he's a fighter. They all are. And their mother. She's a queen." Elias found himself talking, the words rusty and stiff at first. He told her how he had found them. He didn't speak of his grief or his past, but Martha seemed to understand it all anyway. She saw the folded flag on his mantle, the single photo of a smiling woman on his nightstand. "Sometimes," she said softly, looking at him with those piercing eyes, "God doesn't rescue us from the storm. He rescues us with a storm." Martha's visit, a balm to his soul, inadvertently set in motion the next crisis. Word of the hermit with the dogs trickled down the valley. A week later, an official-looking truck crunched up his long, unplowed driveway. A man in a county sheriff's uniform, his name tag reading Deputy Miller, stepped out. He was young, polite, and clearly uncomfortable. "Sir," he began, "we got a call. Just have to check it out. Protocol." Elias's entire body went rigid. He stood in the doorway, a silent, immovable obstacle. Miller explained the situation. Unregistered animals, especially a mother with a litter, had to be brought to the county shelter. They would be held for a period, checked for a microchip, and evaluated. If unclaimed, they would be put up for adoption. The words separated echoed in the silent space between them. The thought of Tank's clumsy antics, Whisper's quiet trust, and Sheba's noble dignity being confined to a sterile cage, of them being split up and sent away to strangers, was more than Elias could bear. It was a threat to his unit, his family. "No," he said. The single word was flat, absolute. It was not a request, it was a statement of fact. Deputy Miller sighed. "Sir, I understand, but it's the law. I'm not trying to be difficult. They look well cared for, but my hands are tied." He saw the intractable look in Elias's eyes, the look of a man who would break before he would bend. Look, he offered, a concession. I'll give you 48 hours. Get them to a vet. Get them checked out. Get the paperwork started. Show me you're handling it officially, and maybe I can push this down the road. But in 2 days, I have to come back, and I'll have to take them. The ultimatum was a declaration of war. As Miller's truck disappeared down the driveway, a cold fury, an emotion Elias hadn't felt in years, settled over him. This was not a negotiation. It was a defense. He was defending his home. He was defending his family. He called the veterinarian Martha had recommended, a Dr. Anna Riley. Her voice on the phone was calm and reassuring. She agreed to make a house call, given the circumstances and the treacherous road conditions. She would be there the next morning, but the confrontation had unsettled the delicate peace of the cabin. Sheba, sensitive to every shift in Elias's emotional state, became agitated. She paced, whining low in her throat, her eyes constantly darting to the door. The next day, as Elias was watching for the vet's arrival, a logging truck rumbled down the main road at the bottom of the valley, its engine backfiring with a series of sharp cracks that sounded like gunfire. The sound ripped through the quiet morning air. For Elias, it was a familiar echo of the battlefield. For Sheba, it was a terrifying unknown threat. In a blind panic, she bolted. She shoved past Elias, a blur of sable fur, and shot out the open door. Sheba, he yelled. The puppies, startled by his shout and their mother's flight, scrambled after her. Tank tumbled enthusiastically into the snow, while Whisper hesitated for a moment, torn between fear and his loyalty to Elias, before following his mother. They disappeared into the dense woods that bordered his property. Elias's heart plunged into ice. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his parka and plunged into the snow after them, his mind a whirlwind of frantic calculations. The temperature was dropping as another weather front moved in. The woods were vast and treacherous, crisscrossed with ravines and patches of unstable ice over frozen creeks. His old knee injury, a souvenir from a hard landing in the Hindu Kush, screamed in protest as he pushed through the deep snow, but he ignored it. The pain was irrelevant. All that mattered was the mission. Bring them home. He found their tracks easily in the fresh powder and followed them at a punishing pace. He called Sheba's name, his voice swallowed by the thick, silent trees. He followed the trail for nearly a mile, deeper and higher into the unforgiving terrain. The tracks led to the edge of a steep, icy ravine. At the bottom, a creek flowed, mostly frozen over but with a channel of dark, fast-moving water visible in the center. He saw them. Sheba was on the other side, barking frantically. Tank was nearby, trying to dig his way back up the slippery bank. But Whisper was in the middle of the frozen creek. The ice around him was fracturing, a spiderweb of cracks spreading with every terrified movement he made. Time seemed to slow down. Elias saw the inevitable. The ice would give way, and the frigid water would claim the small pup in seconds. He didn't think. He acted. He slid down the embankment, using trees to break his descent. He hit the bottom hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body. Stay, he commanded Sheba and Tank, his voice a low, authoritative bark that cut through their panic. He crawled onto the ice, distributing his weight as he had been taught in cold weather survival training. The ice groaned under him. He could hear it cracking, feel the sickening shift beneath his hands and knees. He kept his eyes locked on Whisper, who was whimpering, paralyzed with fear. Easy, boy, Elias murmured, his voice calm, projecting a confidence he did not feel. I've got you. He was 10 feet away, then 5. The ice gave a loud crack, and a fissure shot out from under his hand. He was running out of time. He lunged forward, grabbing the scruff of Whisper's neck, and in the same motion he rolled, pulling the pup onto his own chest as the ice beneath them finally gave way. The world became a dizzying, breathtaking shock of black, icy water. The cold was a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs, paralyzing his muscles. He held Whisper above the surface, his other arm flailing, searching for a purchase on the jagged edge of the ice. His heavy clothes were dragging him down. The current was pulling him under. This is it, he thought, a strange sense of calm washing over him. He had completed the mission. Just as the darkness began to close in around the edges of his vision, a hand clamped down on the collar of his parka. "Got you," a voice grunted. "Don't you dare let go." It was Deputy Miller. He had come back early, a nagging feeling of unease, prompting him to check on the stubborn veteran. He had found the empty cabin and followed the tracks. Now he was lying flat on the stable ice, his legs hooked around a tree root on the bank, holding on to Elias with all his strength. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Elias shoved Whisper onto the solid ice, and Miller, grunting with effort, hauled him from the water's deadly embrace. Elias lay on the ice, gasping, shivering so violently his teeth chattered. Miller helped him to his feet, and together they gathered the terrified dogs. The journey back was a haze of pain and cold. By the time they reached the cabin, Dr. Anna Riley's truck was parked outside. She met them at the door, her kind eyes widening in alarm at the sight of them. The next hour was a controlled flurry of activity. Anna, calm and efficient, took charge. She wrapped Elias in heated blankets, forcing hot coffee into his trembling hands, while simultaneously examining the puppies and their mother. Deputy Miller, his official demeanor gone, helped stoke the fire and brought in towels, his face a mixture of awe and concern. Elias, his body slowly succumbing to the warmth, watched them work. He watched Anna gently check Whisper's breathing, her touch both professional and deeply compassionate. He watched Miller give Tank a reassuring scratch behind the ears. He watched Sheba, her ordeal over, finally settle by the fire, licking her pups, her amber eyes fixed on him with an expression of profound gratitude. His cabin, his fortress of solitude, was filled with people, with warmth, with life. It was no longer a prison. It was a command center for a rescue operation. It was a home. Later, when the immediate crisis had passed, Anna sat across from him at the small kitchen table, a mug of tea warming her hands. "You know," she said softly, "what you did back there was insane." He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "It was also the bravest thing I've ever heard of." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "These dogs, they're your family, aren't they?" Elias looked over at the sleeping pile of fur by the fire. He saw Sheba's unwavering loyalty, Tank's foolish courage, Whisper's quiet soul. He looked at the faces of the people who had helped him, who had breached his walls not with force, but with kindness. "Yes," he said, the word feeling more true than anything he had said in years. "They are." Deputy Miller, before he left, tore up the official notice. "I'll file a report," he said, clapping Elias on the shoulder. "Found dogs, officially adopted by a local hero." End of story. In the weeks that followed, the cabin was transformed. The sterile silence was replaced by the happy yelps of growing puppies and the gentle thud of Sheba's tail against the floorboards. Anna became a regular visitor, bringing supplies and expertise, her presence a quiet promise of a future he had never thought possible. Martha continued her deliveries of stew and wisdom. Elias began to build a series of large, comfortable kennels in the barn, his hands finding purpose in creation rather than destruction. He talked to Anna and Martha about his idea, a sanctuary, a place for retired military and police dogs, or any working breed that needed a second chance, a place for wounded warriors, both human and canine, to heal together. He would call it Ghost Point in honor of the partner he had lost. One evening, as the spring sun melted the last of the snow, casting long golden shadows across the valley, Elias sat on his porch. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sheba rested at his feet. Tank was clumsily chasing a moth in the yard, while Whisper leaned contentedly against his leg. The fortress had become a haven. The internal winter had finally given way to a thaw. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old worn harmonica, one he hadn't touched since Sarah had been alive. He brought it to his lips and played a simple, quiet melody. It wasn't a song of grief anymore. It was a song of gratitude, of peace, of a new mission. He was Elias Thorne, the man who had been rescued by the family he never expected, in the home he had finally found. And for the first time in a very long time, he was smiling.